Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Foran. I'm the Associate Director for Climate Programs at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion on New York State's ambitious energy and climate goals and the land use considerations in achieving them. I especially want to thank at the outset the Energy Innovation Reform Project and Paul Saunders for their partnership in this event. So before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping from me. This event is on the record. We're currently live streaming to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about the event on any social media. And when you do, please use the hashtag ACEnergy and tag us at AC Global Energy. So those participating by Zoom, we all know the drill by now, but you can submit questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your screen. Once we get to the discussion and Q&A portion, we'll try to answer as many as we can. So we're so excited to host this conversation with our esteemed panelists that bring a variety of perspectives from their work in the New York State energy space. New York State has set some of America's most ambitious renewable power goals, calling for 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emission power by 2040. Nevertheless, citing new projects has been a hurdle in communities across the state, and permitting timelines have slowed efforts to develop additional solar and wind capacity. Even after new legislation intended to ease procedural hurdles, challenges remain to building out clean energy capacity in the state on the timeline necessary. State leaders have really played a key role in overcoming these challenges and adapting the regulatory environment for progress. So we're grateful to be joined by key stakeholders and state leaders who will discuss the state's energy landscape and pathways forward to achieving its 2040 goal. We're first going to hear from Richard Kaufman, chairman of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, a role through which he essentially leads the implementation of New York's climate ambition. No small feat. So Richard, thanks for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Kelsey, and thanks everybody for participating today. So I thought what I would do is to set the stage for the discussion. And I just want to make a couple of sort of Miranda type comments at the beginning, or warnings, I guess is maybe the better thing, is that we have a new governor. Governor Hochul has just been in the job for just a short period of time. She's been enormously supportive of the state's clean energy objectives, but she's a new governor. And the other thing is that the law that commits the state to 70% renewable energy by 2030, the CLCPA, it has as part of its implementation the Climate Action Council, and the Climate Action Council is still in process of doing a number of things in its mandate. So just want to make those introductory comments. So I have a couple of things, just two slides that to set the stage here. So one is where we are today, or 2019, and what the objectives are for 2030, which, as we said, 70% electricity from renewable sources. And you can see that today it's less than 30% is renewable, and a lot of that is legacy hydro. But when you look to the right, you can see that what's already been awarded and contracted is a meaningful percentage towards the goal. And in terms of the next slide, this also gives you a flavor of the mix, and you can see the importance of offshore wind. So it means that when we look ahead to say what's needed to be contracted, almost half of it is offshore wind. So the land use issues with respect to offshore wind are obviously quite different than onshore resources. So the other point I would make here is that, and this is not surprising, New York Sun is really the distributed solar, which is only going to represent a small piece. So when we talk about land use issues, it's really going to be the large-scale solar and wind projects in the state. So the problem is not the resources. There are ample resources in the state, both onshore wind, offshore wind, even solar. There's now the capacity to bring in hydro from Canada. And in addition to New York State, the state's renewable target can be achieved from resources that are brought from other states, as long as they can be delivered into the state. So the problem is not resources. The problem is a number of things, and one of which, as Kelsey talked about, are siting issues. And there is, I think, increasing resistance to projects in a number of areas in the state. And that's because, frankly, the rural areas don't get the benefits or perceive the benefits of the projects, because there's not a lot of employment from the projects. And yes, there are some tax benefits, but they're limited in many cases. And again, if you're talking about regions where there's been there's going to be shutdown of conventional power plants, it's actually a net loss to those communities economically, because the power plants employ more people and can have a much larger value in terms of the tax base. So there is this new act that creates a siting office, and that's not really yet completely up and running, but the intent is that that applications for the permit have to be acted on and within 1 year after they're deemed to be complete. Now the question is, what does that mean in terms of being completed? And then and in areas where there's already been some kind of other industrial development at 6 months, and that if the siting office does not act within the period of time, then the draft permit would be deemed to be approved. So that should accelerate the siting process. But again, that remains to be seen how well that's going to work. I think the other issues, just quickly, is that the number that I said before, really does not take into account, I don't believe, electrification of everything. It doesn't take into account what's going to happen in terms of electrification of transportation and heating. So we would need more renewables than what that number that I put forth. And if we also are going to need more renewables, we're going to need more transmission. And transmission there are a number of transmission projects that are underway, but transmission, again, raises a bunch of land use policies, because the transmission, the bulk of the load in New York is New York City, and the resources are far from the city, and so trying to site transmission lines across the Hudson Valley, for example, has been very, very difficult, because that's a scenic area, and so there's a lot of community opposition to transmission. I guess the other couple things I would say is that in terms of technology uncertainty, we have supported the nuclear plants, and the nuclear plants that begins to expire in 2030, and so we really don't know what's going to happen to the nuclear plants and the support after 2030. We also know that from a technology standpoint, there's increasing interest in carbon sequestration, and how much that's going to have an impact, because it's going to be difficult to imagine New York City operating purely on wind and solar, and so we're going to have how much we need to think about carbon sequestration to offset the power, to offset conventional power plants. And then the last point I just want to make is that goes to the current way that that renewables are supported in the state and the challenge of distribution utilities, because the utilities, which are really passing along the cost of the renewable projects to customers. But the utilities don't have any real financial incentive to, or have not taken advantage of any financial incentive to try to really create a grid that would better balance the intermittency of renewables with demand side resources. So we have already a very low average capacity utilization in the grid, the whole system. It's about 54%. And so if we think about adding more and more renewables to the system, that average capacity utilization is going to actually go down. And so the issue here is really also about affordability, because we have resources. We can maybe get over the siting issues, but the affordability issues, if we can't keep working on improving the average capacity utilization of the system, and as a consequence, changing the utility business model to do that, it's going to be a real challenge for New Yorkers. And we already have 1 million New Yorkers that are having difficulty paying their electricity bills. And that was even before COVID. So why don't I stop there?
Thanks so much, Richard. That was an excellent overview of kind of where things stand and how we can look to the future and see where things are going. So I'm going to hand the floor now to Paul Saunders of EIRP for a discussion on a report that he authored that EIRP is releasing today on the challenges and opportunities that New York faces amidst all of these dynamics. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you to Mr. Kaufman and all the other panelists for taking part. And I guess before I start, maybe 2 or 3 notes of humility here. One is that I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, and everyone else speaking here is really full-time working in New York. And I think accordingly, I'll try to be quite humble in my pronouncements from a few hundred miles away. Secondly, I'm going to try to be very brief. The report is quite long. I can't really cover everything. I'll do my best to highlight a few interesting points, or at least points that I think are interesting. Whether others think they're interesting is up to all of you. And finally, it was a report that was, whenever one is writing about a moving target, it's hard to keep entirely up to date with everything that's happening. And there's a great deal happening in this space, as Mr. Kaufman noted. I think New York was especially interesting to us as a case to study for several reasons. I would say first and foremost, as Kelsey mentioned, clearly a leader among states in setting very ambitious targets. Secondly, though, New York is an interesting case because in some respects, when we're thinking about trying to make this, massive clean energy transition, it's actually kind of an easy case in certain respects compared to many other states. It's a relatively wealthy state. It has the second largest state budget behind only California. It has very substantial nuclear and hydro generation compared to the national average, already around 57% or so between those two. Everyone else, please correct me if I'm off there. In addition to that, of course, NYSERDA, which has really a very special role in procuring renewable power, which is not something that we see in many other states, and I think can certainly play an important part in managing this transition. And of course, the New York Independent System Operator, which really has to work only with one state in managing the grid, unlike many other states that are either part of a multi-state grouping or not a part of an ISO or a regional transmission organization. At the same time, New York has some challenges. Mr. Kaufman is certainly correct that there are plenty of resources, solar and wind in the state. At the same time, the solar is not really as good as it is in many other places. New York is a northern state. It's the fourth cloudiest state in the country. That makes it a little bit more expensive and somewhat more land intense to do solar in New York than it would be elsewhere. Offshore wind, certainly, however, as Mr. Kaufman noted, a very great advantage for the state. Solar and wind generation so far really lagging behind national averages, in part for the reasons that have already come up because of these land use challenges. Now, looking backward at the previous procedures that the state used to permit these projects, they took between 3 and 4.5 years in rough terms, according to our research here. The new Office of Renewable Energy Siting certainly seems to, at least in the couple of initial cases, to have accelerated that. And I saw that they have issued actually 2 permits in 6 months for a couple of solar projects. I think, as Mr. Kaufman noted, we'll see how that goes in the future. I guess, to wrap up, because I don't really want to talk too long, I'd like to leave time for others for discussion, for questions. I think one of the most interesting questions really for me is the political question in developing renewables, whether solar or wind, and Mr. Kaufman certainly addressed part of some of the reasons that's been challenging in rural areas in New York, and I imagine elsewhere. And I guess from my point of view, after having done about a year ago a very significant study on land use for renewable power and really reviewing about 100 government studies and academic reports on that topic. On one hand, I think there's an academic view that the United States is a very big country and there's kind of plenty of land, and therefore there's a lot of ability to generate wind and solar power. I think the challenge, as I see it, is that the land has to be available not only in the sense of being undeveloped or perhaps previously developed but no longer in use. It also has to be politically available, meaning that the people who live in the community have to be willing to accept the projects. And again, I think Mr. Kaufman covered many of the reasons why that's been a challenge in New York. And I think as we look ahead, it will be really critical for the state and for other states that are trying to pursue these types of renewable power goals to find ways to help the communities to accept the projects. And Unfortunately, I expect it's quite challenging to do that. New York's 2020 law on accelerating renewable energy development, did mandate community benefits. The benefits, I think, are perhaps rather modest from the perspective of people who are thinking about what they may have to live next to for the next 20 or 30 years. It's not clear to what extent that will make a sufficient difference in making the projects more acceptable. And I guess maybe a final point, and I'll just end here. I'm sorry, I've talked a little bit longer than I hope to. I certainly don't want to single out renewable development as a particular problem. I don't view it as being fundamentally different from other kinds of development in many rural areas. And I think part of the reason that people live in rural areas is that they want to live in rural areas. As a result, they're not enthusiastic about new development, regardless of what it is. Anyway, let me perhaps end there. Sorry to take a little longer than I hoped, and certainly look forward to hearing from others.
Thanks, Paul. And in a bit, we're going to drop a link to his report in the chat for those of you who are joining us via Zoom. If not, you can view it on the EIRP website. So now we're going to turn to our virtual panel. So it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists who have so kindly agreed to spend this hour with us. So Gavin Donahue is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Independent Power Producers of New York, or IPNI. Joe Martens is the Director of the New York Offshore Wind Alliance at the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. And Betta Broad is the Director for New Yorkers for Clean Power, as well as the Director of Advocacy and Organizing for the Association for Energy Affordability. So thanks so much to all three of you for being here with us. Let's get right into it. So Gavin, I think I'm going to start with you. Could you tell us a bit about your view from IPNI, any reactions you may have to what we've heard, just kind of what your perspective is in this space?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and having IPNI represented here. I appreciate the opportunity. I've spent a little bit of time with Paul's report. Just so the audience knows, my organization has been around since 1986. We represent over 3/4 of the generation in New York State. We represent renewables, we represent nuclear plants, we represent fossil fuel as well, waste to energy. So if you generate electricity in New York State, you're probably a member of the organization. So we are the private developers. Just to pick up on a couple things that Richard talked about, we represent probably over 2,000 megawatts of the contracted renewable resources that are under the clean energy standard that NYSERDA has issued contracts for. We're very proud of that. As it pertains to the report, the local impact issues and the land use issues that I was able to review in the report are real. There is a constant historical tension between upstate and downstate on a variety of issues, whether it's transportation issues or the availability of drinking water or energy. Upstate has the space, the land, but then as Richard talked about, some limits on the benefits that do go to upstate New York. So the tension there is huge. The local home rule issues in New York State have guided the state for hundreds of years. Getting local input, getting local feedback before the state makes decisions has always been critically important. And you can have all the laws you want. That's a reality that you have to work through, as developers have to work through, the state has to work through. And if we're going to achieve these goals, New York State really, really needs to execute and needs to make tough calls. And sometimes that's politically complicated to do. My organization supports the mandates under the CLCPA, and how we transition there is how we get there is really important. But we're supportive of the 70 by 30 and the zero emissions by 2040. We think natural gas is still going to be important in the coming years. Something we did not talk about, but your report does mention, is carbon pricing. We think that for the state to achieve these goals, you need a market incentive You need DEC to set up carbon price that's high enough that attracts the next generation of resources. So we need a private market outcome, and I'm proud to acknowledge the work of Beta in the Power Gen panel. They did talk about, and as part of our council's recommendations, to have private market solutions as a way to drive the achievement of these goals. And I think that that is an important concept that can't be lost. Cost and affordability, Richard did mention that. I was happy to hear him mention that. That is critically important. We have, as you probably all know, you have the federal infrastructure bill, you have the budget. There's well over $70 billion in the infrastructure bill for a lot of these clean energy projects that the president has proposed. The budget has almost $200 billion in there on electrification and cleaning up buildings. So for me, I want to make sure that we don't put ratepayers here in New York at a disadvantage by asking them to pay twice when the federal government has money out there. And I think that that's an important nuance that wasn't mentioned here. I was making some notes when Paul spoke. I think New York State, it's right, is a laboratory for experience and for change. I don't think it should be lost on the folks that are here. We are a one-state ISO. So we have a one-state PSC and we have the New York ISO. So we can make changes that other states can't because they have multiple jurisdictions. And I think that that is really important for folks to understand. Couple other points. Richard talked about importing out-of-state resources. We have issues with some of that because if we're just going to import coal or oil resources from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and dirty the air further, I don't know what we're accomplishing here in New York State. So we think that in-state projects make the most sense. But to just say we're going to import resources from other control areas, to me, has to be done very carefully and looked at to ensure that we're not infringing on the environment any further. The next thing is, and the last thing I'll talk about is dispatchability. There are reports by New York City, there's reports by the ISO, NYSERDA, that New York State requires dispatchable resources to keep the lights on. Reliability has to be the number one issue. We got to make sure that we have a reliable electricity system, and attracting new resources like carbon capture sequestration or renewable natural gas or some version of hydrogen or fuel cells or things that we don't even know exist today are really important. And I was happy to hear and see in the report that you mentioned and highlighted the need for dispatchability. So we're happy that we've asked the PSC to start a petition to identify what types of new technologies are we going to need in 2035 and 2040 that are zero emissions that keep the lights on. Because at the end of the day, you can't run the system just on renewable resources. They are intermittent at best. Storage isn't perfected yet. So that to me is one of the biggest priorities I have, is the transition is important, the details matter, reliability, costs matter, and again, sending that private market signal for that investment, I think is critically important to achieve these goals. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gavin. And you brought up a few points I want to circle back to in the Q&A. But first, let's hear from Joe Martens. What's the history here, Joe, in this state, and how can New York achieve all it's set out to?
Thanks, Kelsey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again to the Atlanta Council for inviting me to participate. And it is a real pleasure to be on the panel with my colleagues, Beta and Gavin, and good to see Richard Kaufman again. So I have a little bit different tact on this. I work for an organization called the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, and I'm the director of the New York Offshore Wind Alliance. I am not going to talk about offshore wind. Hopefully there'll be some questions that come up in the question and answer section, because I think offshore wind is going to be, not only, as Richard said, critically important, but it's going to have a very oversized role in getting New York to 70 by 30 or 100% by 40. But I'm going to start by stating the obvious, that we really do have our work cut out for us in New York to achieve the state's ambitious renewable energy standards. And while concerns about the land use implications of renewable energy projects are important, I don't think they're nearly as daunting as they seem or are often made out to be, and I'm going to explain why in a second. So it's pretty clear that in order to reach the CLCPA's required 70% by 2030 and 100% carbon-free by 2040, we need to build a lot of renewable energy projects, onshore wind and solar, more hydropower, offshore wind, and battery storage. And we need to dramatically increase the efficient use of all that energy. But it can be done, and as several people have noted, we have plenty of land in New York State to build those projects on. A few quick points to start the discussion. First, New York has always been an environmental leader and one of the first states to enact progressive environmental laws to protect its air, water, and land resources. And I have to say that even I was surprised when the legislature and the governor came together to enact the CLCPA. But it did so because governments can't simply point the finger and wait for someone else to act to address the climate crisis. Year after year, we see new records for the hottest average global temperatures. We've all witnessed the increased severity and frequency of massive fires, droughts, floods, hurricanes, and more. And it's high time we did something about it. And I'm really proud that New York has taken the lead and built plenty of land use and natural resource protections into the process. So the ban on high volume hydraulic fracturing in 2015, something I had a hand in, was, from my point of view, the state's first giant step away from the use of fossil fuels. And that was followed by the rejection of several new gas pipelines. And in thinking about the land use implications of renewables, we can't forget the land use impacts that fracking and major gas pipelines would have had if they had been allowed to go forward. And while I spent a good part of my career conserving land and protecting thousands of acres of beautiful places in New York and beyond, I don't think renewable energy development is the threat that it is sometimes painted to be. Developers need both a permit and they need community support, so they have every incentive to avoid wetlands, deforestation, and endangered species. And the NYSERDA contracting process, both the Clean Energy Standard and New York Sun, have a disincentive for soil types 1 through 4 and an incentive for certain locations like brownfields, landfills, and parking canopies. And the New York State Build Ready program is designed to identify hard to develop sites like previously used industrial locations. And all of these mechanisms are designed to site projects in locations where they don't have to cut down trees or use prime agricultural lands. And with all of these incentives and disincentives in place, there's going to be less impact to these resources. But as with all commercial and industrial land uses, there will be some, and that's the balance that New York State is going to have to strike. So I'm just going to close with a quick back of the envelope illustration to give you some sense of perspective regarding the impact of solar development, just as an example on New York's landscape. In the 70% by 2030 white paper prepared by the Department of Public Service, the mix of resources predicted to achieve 70 by 2030 included the solar already contracted for, but not yet built, and that was about 4,829 megawatts, plus 10,025 megawatts to be contracted in the future. And if you add in about 3,000 megawatts of distributed solar projects, you get a total of 17,854 megawatts of solar. So let's round that up to 20,000 megawatts just to be super conservative and multiply it by the 6.5 acres needed to generate 1 megawatt of electricity from solar panels. This overestimation would get you 130,000 acres, or 0.37% of New York's landmass. And if all that 130,000 acres were built in forested lands, which is obviously highly unlikely, it would impact 0.69% of New York's forests. And if all of the solar was built on New York's active farmland, it would be about 1.8% of all active farmland. So I don't mean to gloss over the importance of proper siting or local concerns. They are hugely important. And as Gavin pointed out, there is a long history here of home rule in New York. But we don't need a massive amount of land to build our renewable energy infrastructure. And we should be able to properly site the projects we need to keep the lights on, power our residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. I'll stop there in the interest of time and make sure Betta has enough time, and I welcome comments at the conclusion of her remarks. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Joe. And you're right, we will certainly return to the offshore wind piece. So Betta, over to you. What are you seeing in your work with New Yorkers for Clean Power and in the affordability space? What's your view on all of this so far?
Thanks so much, Kelsey. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me to participate. It was interesting to read the report, which I got last night and got to skim from Paul on the challenges that we're facing in achieving our climate goals. But I have to say, I don't agree with the findings of the report that counting nuclear as renewable or investing in new nuclear and fossil fuel generation paired with carbon capture are the solutions that we should be focusing on. As part of the CLCPA implementation process that was mentioned, the Climate Action Council has been tasked with developing a scoping plan to make sure that we do achieve our nation-leading targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by transitioning off fossil fuels and scaling up energy efficiency and clean energy solutions. And I serve on one of the panels that developed recommendations to the Climate Action Council, the Power Generation Advisory Panel. And I wanted to share some of those recommendations with you all today because I believe they're an important part of how we're going to succeed. Paul's report lays out some of the technical challenges to scaling up wind and solar in New York, which I'm not going to talk about right now, other than to say that Germany is a global leader in solar and it's just as cloudy as New York. I'm going to address some of the issues raised in the other issues raised in the report. Yes, so far, progress with getting projects built has been slow, mostly because of the Article 10 siting process and misinformation spread by opponents of renewable energy. But now that we have the new Office of Renewable Energy siting up and running and new rules to streamline the process, things should move much faster. And yes, there is opposition, but there are also supporters. There are farmers who are counting on being able to lease their land so that they can keep their farms. There are small business owners and municipal leaders who want to take advantage of this economic opportunity and receive benefits through tax payments and investments in local infrastructure that many project developers make with host community benefit agreements. Opponents to renewable energy are working hard to stir up NIMBY sentiments and disinformation, such as our former president, who claimed that wind turbines cause cancer. This is why it is so essential that we launch a major public education campaign about climate and clean energy so that everyone understands that while the existential threat we're facing is dire, it is not insurmountable. And we have the technological solutions that will create benefits for all New Yorkers as we shift to a clean energy economy. This type of campaign would educate and inform residents and businesses about how they can make changes in their own communities to decarbonize buildings and transportation and support siting renewables and storage. And yes, transmission. Connect people with clean energy programs, job training, and educational opportunities. Include PSAs on television and radio, social media, billboards, and print media, school curricula, community-based outreach and education. We need to mandate K-12 climate science and clean energy education so that our young people feel empowered, not in despair. And we have to create clean energy career pathways so that we're training the workforce we need to transition so that we really can build back better to encourage more young people to go into the trades and get access to family-sustaining jobs. Here are some of the other recommendations we believe will help create more goodwill and fact-based decision-making for siting renewable energy. Provide support and funding for regional planning agencies to assist municipalities to plan for and implement renewable energy development. Research and incentivize agrivoltaics, co-location, and multi-use programs to address agricultural impact concerns. Explore opportunities and models for community ownership or partnership with LSR, projects through local economic development organizations or community choice aggregation agreements. Make host community benefits more robust and targeted. Invest in local weatherization assistance and energy efficiency programs. Scaling up energy efficiency is key for energy affordability, for reducing demand and creating healthier homes and green jobs. We can also incentivize local climate resilience hubs and create a central location that has solar plus storage and can become a place the community will go to during power outages. Encourage a collaborative mapping process between utilities and municipalities to identify the best locations for distributed and utility scale renewables that take into account available electric system capacity and local land use priorities, and identify beneficial locations for grid upgrades and maximize renewable build-out consistent with local goals. By doing this, we can empower local governments to become partners in siting renewable energy projects. These are just some of the many recommendations that I hope will be incorporated into the Climate Action Council's scoping plan and begin to be implemented by New York State. And some of these are already underway by nonprofit organizations and municipalities that are climate leaders. Now, Paul's report talked about it being undemocratic to override local laws. And of course, we must do everything we can to work collaboratively with municipalities. That being said, does he really think that those same communities are going to be eager to host new fossil fuel or nuclear projects? If people are concerned about wind turbines killing birds, and while we're at it, cats kill more birds than turbines by orders of magnitude, what are they going to think about a polluting smokestack or radioactive nuclear waste in their backyard? Nuclear and gas can never be clean. They both leave a legacy of poison where they are extracted. They both pollute the air and water, and nuclear has that intractable waste problem. Gas explodes and nuclear has meltdowns. Besides being dangerous, new nuclear plants are the most expensive energy source, and they take decades to site, gain licenses, and build. The only new nuclear plant under construction right now in the United States will cost $27 billion or more, twice as much as originally promised, and is 5 years behind schedule. The truth is, this is hard, and it's not without its challenges. No one has ever done this before, and we're learning as we go. But we've already made incredible strides in renewables, demonstrating that we need not throw up our hands, accept defeat, and bow to the false technology solutions that the nuclear and fossil fuel industries are offering up. This is certainly not what the Power Gen Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council has recommended, and I stand by those recommendations. We need to be laser focused in this moment on reaching our 70 by 30 target, launching creative programs, and working collaboratively with key stakeholders and community members. Because it's going to take all of us working together to transform our society and save our planet. This is an all hands on deck moment, but I believe we can make the shift, and I hope you will support and join our campaign, New Yorkers for Clean Power, as we do everything we can today to ensure a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Betta. And I would like to turn to Paul, if I could, and give him a chance to respond to some of the comments that we've heard. And then we'll move to a Q&A, or if anybody, I'll open the floor up as well if any other panelists want to have a direct response to anything that's been said. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kelsey. I think there are far too many points from the discussion here for me to try to respond to everything. Perhaps if I could just make one comment, it would be to point toward the World Bank's Minerals for Climate Action report, which used International Energy Agency projections to do some modeling around the increase in material requirements that would be necessary to build out solar and wind on the pace that's necessary to hit the 1.5 degree or 2 degree targets that people hope to reach in terms of averting climate change. And in order to get there, we have to have to get to 1.5 degrees C, to stay under that, we need to increase the amount of mining of 17 different minerals by about 4.5 times between today and 2050 globally, talking about the whole planet here. And the total volume across the 30-year period between now and then will be double what it otherwise would have been. So I'm not a wind and solar opponent. I think they're great technologies. Just let me be clear. What I'm trying to say here is that there is no free lunch. And we can certainly help ourselves in some areas by developing more wind and solar, but we're going to pay the price in other areas. And I think we should be honest with ourselves about that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. Any other thoughts from other panelists before we move to Q&A?
So
just to build on something Joe said, about local support for projects. I think the law and the ORES law that cites these projects provides a significant amount of intervener funds. Then the state also has the ability to modify these projects to support and be consistent with the community character. So it's just not like the state of New York says, hey, you're going to take this project and that's it. There's a mechanism in this law that hasn't been touched on in this forum to help move local governments forward and get community support in the citing of it. So I think that builds upon some of the arguments that Joe made about the willingness to cite some of these projects.
thanks, Gavin. Great point, because both the regs and the law are expansive. 143 pages of regs about the siting process, what to avoid, the assistance to communities, input from the communities. I mean, it is not as if the state is rolling over local governments as it has been characterized in certain places. It's not, but there's no question we need to accelerate the process. And I did want to respond to Paul's comment, because I think there is none of us who want to overlook, any of the impacts that it's going to take to make the conversion from fossil fuels to renewables. And we all ought to have our eyes open every step of the way in a global sense. But I would also reiterate a point I made in my remarks is we've already paid an enormous price for our use of fossil fuels. And I'm not pointing at the fossil fuel industry per se. We've all benefited from that. This country and the world grew on the backs of fossil fuels. But now we are paying an extraordinary price for that. And so all of that needs to be taken into consideration as we move forward. And I'm very proud of New York for taking a leadership role on this, setting deadlines, very ambitious ones, but also creating this process, including the Climate Council that both Betta and Gavin sit on, to explore basically every avenue for how we get there, and a process that reviews the collective impact of all of that. It is an enormous undertaking, and I could not be more proud of New York State, NYSERDA, the PSC, and others, because they've really leaned into this, and all of the not-for-profits that have been involved in this process. It has been a stakeholder extensive process, and it's just the right way to go about it. So I think New York again is setting a model. I know the challenges are enormous, but I'm very confident because of this process that we're actually going to reach the finish line.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, everybody. I think I'm going to switch gears here a bit and direct a question towards Gavin. So recently, IPNI has been working with labor unions in addressing how we can fit different things into the clean energy future of New York. So I'm curious, what is the role that labor unions play in this, and what is your partnership with labor unions in New York State?
Well, thanks for the question. We have been working with the AFL-CIO and the building trades across New York State because they realize that we no longer have goals. We have statutory mandates in New York, and they are concerned about their future in being able to have jobs, sort of something that Betta talked about with career education. And they feel strongly that the labor unions need to work with the generator community because they need the jobs as pipe fitters, carpenters, boiler makers. They need that. And they also believe that they've educated themselves on some of these issues, that the issue I mentioned earlier about dispatchability of resources and how you keep the lights on in a zero emission environment by 2030, 2040. We could put a program together that models the program we have for wind and solar and storage now, and we could potentially put a REC program together to attract private investment to New York, to provide the new technologies that we need to keep the lights on. And they're not my stats, they're the ISO, they're NYSERDA's stats. Every independent study talks about the need for dispatchability. So the labor unions are looking at it as a job development issue, job security issue. And they realize that the generator community and the private companies I work for are the ones that are going to provide the private capital for building those projects. So it became a natural relationship, and I've begun working quite closely with the labor unions on a lot of different issues because they see the future and they realize it's a statutory requirement now.
Great, thanks, Gavin. Joe, I want to make sure to raise a question with you on offshore wind. Give us, I know there's been a lot going on, but as best you can, what are the recent developments in New York State on offshore wind? What's the level of support it's receiving? What's the outlook right now in the state for offshore wind?
So thanks for that question, Kelsey. The outlook is extraordinary, to put it in one single word. The state has contracted, or will soon contract, with 5 separate projects for just under 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And the CLCPA requires that we get to 9,000 megawatts. So we've contracted for almost half of that already. And the first project is expected to get its final approvals and start construction next year, so in 2022. And I'd point out that virtually everyone who talks about offshore wind talks about that 9,000 megawatts as being a floor, not a ceiling, because offshore wind is going to be increasingly important, not only in New York, but up and down the East Coast and the West Coast. And it's moving forward rapidly. And I always have to note that, we're 30 years behind Europe in the offshore wind arena. So it's not a new technology. It's tested. These, projects have been generating electricity for 30 years in Europe. So we're advancing very quickly. That 5,000 or a little under 5,000 megawatts is going to provide 30% of New York's demand in 2030. Likewise, when we hit the 9,000 megawatts in 2035, about a third of our expected demand, and when I say expected, I'm including the demand that is going to be created by electrifying significant portions of our economy. It's a point that Richard made earlier, is transportation, commercial and industrial sectors will also have to go transition to electric generation, or electric use rather. And offshore wind is going to provide a third of that. So we don't get to any of the targets that we've talked about here without offshore wind. And I have to say, I'm extraordinarily delighted again in the progress we've made in New York. We've had strong commitments, political commitments from across the aisle for years, and I am nothing but optimistic.
And the benefit also is that it's close to where most people in New York State live. So the transmission issues are much more straightforward.
Exactly. I mean, I could talk for a long time here, Kelsey, about offshore wind, but this was about land use. And the land use issues, by the way, with offshore wind are primarily connected to the transmission lines that connect the offshore wind farms to, and they're not insignificant. Those are also, local challenges. We've seen a local challenge on the east end of Long Island already. But I think that's going to work its way out because on the strength of the merits of the project and the strength of our own laws for siting transmission lines.
Great. And I realize we're pretty short on time, so I want to do a quick round robin. If I can, I'd like to bring in Paul and Richard as well. In one or two sentences, kind of what can we learn at the federal level from the experience in New York State thus far as the U.S. looks to ramp up its climate efforts at the national level? Maybe we'll start with Betta.
Well, I think it's really important to have the targets. New York's clean energy standard is phenomenal because it's making it real. And so fingers crossed, we'll see something similar at the federal level. And also, in the other sectors, decarbonizing buildings, the building sector, they're all tremendously important, but, New York's on the frontier along with California. And as Joe said, I'm very proud to be a New Yorker and grateful to be a part of this transition, and really looking forward to seeing what President Biden and Congress do next. Hopefully they will continue to make moves in the direction that New York is already going in.
Gavin, maybe you next.
Just a couple points. I think New York State has to be ready in case the infrastructure bill and when the budget passes, because there's a lot of money there to accomplish a lot of what we talked about today. And we have to make sure that consumers of New York get the benefit of that federal money. So I think that's one thing. Two, we need regulatory certainty. We need to know what the targets are, what the rules are, how to attract that investment. And three, we need private market structures like the new technologies piece as a way to attract private investment to achieve these goals. So those are the three things I think about.
Joe?
So I think the federal government has already learned quite a few lessons from New York. They have set targets for renewable energy, especially in the offshore wind arena, 30 megawatts by 2030, 30 gigawatts, excuse me, by 2030. They have already called out some very important constituencies that need to be not only involved in the process, but benefit from the process. Gavin talked about labor. The administration has already made strong commitments to labor, knowing that they are going to be the absolutely necessary to get the projects built. They have called out investments in frontline communities and underserved communities, which New York did, again, very early on. So, it's all of those important constituencies and stakeholders that are going to help the political process resolve itself in New York successfully. Because I think when you get broad scale support and support from, again, labor, developers, environmental groups, all pushing in the same direction, I think the politics will follow. I think local governments will also see the benefits and the political rewards for building projects locally. So I think they've already learned a lot. We've got a lot of New Yorkers in the federal administration now, so I don't think it's surprising that they've taken some very strong stances regarding labor, environmental justice, and environmental protection. But once again, I think New York has led here, and the federal government is following in suit.
And Richard, any last comments?
Yeah, just quickly to add on to what others have said. I think that when we talk about establishing end markets, we're talking about one of the things that the federal government can learn is this issue of government dollars being used to reduce soft costs. Because when we talk about offshore wind, one of the reasons why the costs have gone down is because not only we created a large market, but public dollars were used to aggregate demand and do some of the development work that the private sector would have otherwise done. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, and I touched on this before, is that New York has also been a leader in trying to figure out how to change the basic utility business model. Because if we just keep bolting on renewables onto a grid that was never designed for them, it's going to be very expensive. And so that's the other thing that federal government can learn from the New York experience.
And Paul, thoughts from you before we close out?
Well, first, just to reiterate my thanks, Kelsey, to you and your colleagues and Mr. Kaufman and all of the panelists today. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to participate in the discussion. And I guess secondly, you know, from my point of view, I think one of the interesting points that the discussion really highlights is the extent to which federal policy really isn't enough to solve the challenges that we have to solve to push forward with the energy transition. And in our federal system and with the many different systems that states have, there's really a lot that has to happen at the state and local level to get to the place everyone wants to reach.
Thanks, Paul, and I'll wrap us up here. I know we're a couple minutes over time, so thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks especially to our panelists for taking the time to participate, to the Energy Innovation Reform Project for their partnership in this event, to the Atlantic Council events team. Thank you, everybody, for making this work. If you'd like to rewatch the stream, it'll be on our YouTube channel as well as the Atlantic Council website. So thanks again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.